Halloween, everybody. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you a skull and brains 4D design where there is a portion of the skull that pops off the top of it and then you can see these hot pink brains underneath. It's very goofy, kind of just a silly, slightly realistic skull. The hot pink brains, I think, is just a fabulous element. If you wanted to be a little bit more gruesome and gross looking, you could certainly go with the typical red, but me being me, I decided that pink seemed like a better idea. I hope you guys like it as much as I do, and don't forget to click subscribe to see all my future videos as well.
So we are going to begin by applying a black overlay of acrylic across the entire nail. I honestly do not really like doing black overlays. Anytime I do one, it's more of like a challenge to myself, or for some reason I just had this desire to do it. If you were like me and you're like, ugh, black overlays, because black acrylic just tends to be a little bit stickier and gets in your brush and things of that nature, you can certainly just paint the nail black and skip the black acrylic. It's kind of up to you. I do like the depth that an acrylic overlay gives versus just applying a black gel polish. So there are certainly benefits to it. Usually though, I do not think that they outweigh the hassle of dealing with black acrylic. But after it's done, whatever method that you decided to do, whether it's a clear acrylic overlay and then black gel polish or a black acrylic overlay, file it into shape. Then we're going to take, and with pink acrylic, we're going to begin sculpting our brains. So I'm going to begin by doing one hemisphere of the brain with a layer of the pink acrylic, and then taking a silicone tool dipped into the pink acrylic powder, I'm going to sculpt sort of the outlines and the start and the base of the brain matter shape. When you're doing the brains, especially if you're doing it in kind of a cartoony, creative, fun way, as I am, making them hot pink, it's not necessarily specifically going for realism. You can have fun with the shaping of the brains. You want little squiggles that interlock and twirl around each other. And once you have that first basic outline done of them with the silicone tool, take more of your pink acrylic or red or whatever color you're going with, and you can just take and add a little bit more detail to them, add some definition, do some, fine tuning here and there. After you have, a good portion of them done, a good portion of these little brain matter pieces, you can just fill in the gaps, and it doesn't all have to be squiggles or lines or C shapes. If it gets to the point where there's just like a certain circle that's left, you could just add a circle of the pink acrylic. You just want it to have a nice, really bumpy brain matter texture going across the whole thing. And once you have one hemisphere of the brain finished and you've got the full brain texture going over everything, you're going to repeat the process on the other side. Now, as you can see, I've got a lot of 3D height built up on my brain. So it's not where it is really kind of 3D, but it's flatter, it's smoother. There's actual little sections on the side of them where it kind of like curls in and it kind of cups. It goes around. So you don't need to add a magnet to this. You can if you want to. If your brains are thinner, that sounds so weird. If you've got thin brains, then you have different rules. No, if the brain is thinner, just in general, then you're going to probably want to add a magnet if it doesn't have quite as much shape as mine does. That way it'll really hold on the top of the skull once you go to sculpt that and have that on, so that it will keep it there and it'll be properly secured. However, if it's like mine, where it's got this really rounded domed shape across the top of or across the edges of the brains, where there's little like holder places, you probably don't need to have the magnet. I am not going to be adding in a magnet into my brains. And when you're doing it this way and you don't have the magnet added in, then it's a little different because you have to like stretch your acrylic piece at the end so it kind of goes up and over. You'll see that I take it off with a tweezers instead of just trying to slide it off with a magnet. You won't necessarily have that cupping on the sides, so you would just slide it off and it would just be releasing the magnet to get it to move. Where in this case, you have to kind of like open it and bring it up and around, and that works and it holds on excellently, but it is a little bit delicate each time you take it on and off because you are, pulling acrylic, which has a tendency to be brittle. So it's a choose your battle kind of a thing. So I'm going to take some clear acrylic and I'm going to apply that over the very bottom edge of my brains and blend that down so that I have a nice little transition space for when I start to sculpt the skull, and it doesn't sink in around the brain matter. It kind of just is a smoother layer here. It really makes a big difference. So don't miss that step. Definitely add that transition area with the clear acrylic, just as if you're sculpting a nail on a nail form, and you're using color acrylic, you are going to take clear acrylic and blend the natural nail down to the nail form before you go in with your color acrylics. So now using a light dove gray acrylic, I'm going to start sculpting in my skull, the bottom portion of the skull. And so I have that first line of the skull, and then I'm going to take a dotting tool and sort of carve out the eye sockets for what's visible in that first bead of acrylic that I did. If you are not very comfortable sculpting skulls, haven't done many in the past, if you take just a sketching pencil or a number 2 pencil, whatever kind of pencil you have, not graphite or not charcoal, but graphite pencil, just draw in the shapes of your skull, the important features, eye sockets, nasal cavity, around the teeth, cheekbones. Just get some of those basic, this is where this goes, lines drawn in. And then after you start sculpting, you'll cover them up and they'll get, erased essentially. But it'll give you a good idea of where to put things so that as you're sculpting them, especially if it's in pieces like the way that I'm sculpting it, you don't have like a grand, okay, I can slowly add in different shapes. It's a fast-paced environment where you have to, okay, all of a sudden I got to clear out an eye socket. So if you don't have a good working knowledge of how to sculpt or draw skulls, then you may want to just have that drawn in first. I'm going to take many, many layers of this dove gray acrylic, and I'm going to add so much height and detail to my skull. I want this to be exaggerated and over the top, a caricature of a skull, caricature of the brains, not necessarily cute. I wasn't going for cute. And a lot of times when you overdo a skull and you do it a caricature style or a cartoon style, it ends up venturing into cute, unless you take it the opposite direction, you go like real creepy looking. And I wanted it to be somewhere in a balance of not real, but realistic. So not cute, not scary, but just kind of keep it in that exaggerated realism. And so I'm going to definitely make sure that, the eye socket, the bones going around there are really, really tall, really defined. Same thing around the nose. Make sure everything has a lot of height to it, a lot of depth. I'm going to add my teeth, or not my teeth, but like the upper jaw area with more of that gray, taking my silicone tool once again, kind of carve in just the start of the different areas where the teeth will go, kind of just sketch those lines in with the tip of that silicone tool. Connect everything to the side as you're sculpting a skull. This is probably the case with many things that are exaggerated and big like this, but as you're sculpting this skull and you're making these really tall shapes, know that you're going to have to go through with small bits of acrylic and smooth things out from transition. So it's not like unattached pieces, but eventually it just blends together and looks like one cohesive, piece. This is one skull. It's not, we did this huge eye socket piece and then over here we have teeth. It looks cohesive and smooth. So you want to be allowing yourself to do little tiny bits of acrylic as transition pieces from one section to another, and know that you will probably have to go through and continually add little bits of acrylic here and there, little steps after you've sculpted it and you've worked on it for whatever period of time and you're like, is this done? And you are unsure. The thing I like to do is I like to step away from it for a couple minutes, set it down, work on something else, check my email, take a little break, go to the bathroom, get a drink, whatever it is that you need to do. Just step away from it for a couple minutes and then look at it again. And look at it again with your reference photos right next to each other. So you have the nail in one hand, reference photo in the other. And just let your eyes kind of shift back and forth, not looking for anything specific, taking what you've worked on in as a whole, trying not to be too judgmental with yourself, and just kind of see what comes to you. You never know what it's going to be like. You know what? I'm missing something right here. Oh no, I can't believe I forgot this. And then you can take the time to add it before you go too far into doing something else. And when I'm usually working on my crazy 3D, 4D art, I work on 6 to 8 nails at a time. And I do little pieces of them and I jump around and I'll work on this one for a while and then I'll switch to a different one. And that gives me that opportunity to reassess after I've given myself a little break from whichever one it was that I was working on. Because sometimes if you're working on something for too long and you're staring at it for too long, you can't see it as a whole anymore. You get kind of, shook up in your brain. And so in this circumstance, this is one, especially with a skull, that it's very helpful to take a break and come back. And the reason I say for a skull, it's really important, or it can be very helpful, is it's something that a lot of people recognize. It's a shape that isn't abstract. It's not, you're not making something crazy, or, it's not non-specific. It's a specific item that can be tricky because you are making something that is a human face, and people parts, human faces, hands, things of that nature are notoriously difficult to get the proportions correct. And so if you're missing something, it could throw the whole thing off, and you might not see it if you've been staring at this for the last 20 minutes, half hour. And if you can take a break and come back, you might see it. And even if nobody else would see it and you can see it, it just can make the whole thing look a little more cohesive, a little more finished. So now that I've got the majority of my skull sculpted, I'm going to work on the teeth. So I didn't do the teeth yet, and the teeth is the only thing I'm going to be doing with white acrylic. Everything else was that soft gray color. And the reason that I did it with the gray instead of the white, because usually I've sculpted skulls in white. I've sculpted my large selection of skulls in the past. I can put links to my past skull or skeleton themed videos in the description box below. But the reason for this one, I did the skull with gray, is because it is kind of a character. It's not super realistic. I didn't want it to have that bright white look. I wanted it to be a little bit softer for the skull, because that'll make the pink brains against the black background really stand out. It'll also make it so that these teeth that are sculpted with white stand out a little bit further. The other benefit of sculpting something with a gray instead of white is that when you go to highlight it with some white paint, it's a little bit brighter. It highlights it a little bit more. And if you're going for something that's a little bit extreme, a little bit extra, having the ability to highlight it and give it those really bright high points can just be more beneficial to the end goal of being eye-catching and extreme. So we've got the little teeth that I'm sculpting in. Same thing, just kind of going a little bit past the point of realistic. I'm going to be making the incisors really long and pointy, just comparatively to what I would probably do if I was just going for realism. Not quite vampire status, but just a little bit more than normal. Gonna add those last ones on the other side, finish off those teeth. Once you are done with the teeth, you can probably just say you're done sculpting. I'm going to take some black acrylic and I'm going to fill in the eyes. There was a little bit of a smudginess from where the gray acrylic was that I had moved out of the way. And if you like to work with acrylic and like to do shading and depth with acrylic versus, say, a paint product, this is a great time to take some very thin black acrylic and add a little bit of shading in there if you like to. This is one of those, whatever works best for you. I did a combination of black acrylic and black paint for my shading. I really like to actually do it with acrylic. I think it blends out really well, but it's a strange process, and it's nice to kind of be able to do both. I'm going to take a piece of aluminum foil once all of that has been cured, and I'm going to take my fingernail and I'm going to carefully press it all the way around the brains, tucking it in as tightly as I possibly can. And the reason I say carefully is you don't want to puncture your aluminum foil at all. You want no holes in it. It needs to be completely solid. It's got to be a solid piece of aluminum foil. And then after you have that piece of aluminum foil all the way tucked on there, then you're going to take and you're going to attach, or not attach, you're going to sculpt the upper portion of the skull on top of the foil. You should be able to see the little lip, the edge where the top of the skull that is attached to the nail is, right above the brow bone. So you should be able to see that little ledge, and just press this acrylic right up against it, almost as if you are sculpting a 3D French and you're filling in the tip where you've got the ledge that you've sculpted or created with your smile line in your nail bed, and then you press your tip color up against it. Same process as far as just like the way of thinking about it for this. You're just going to press this acrylic right up against that ledge. Make sure that you take it all the way around the edges of your brain so that it goes around and it cups in the sides. And if you are curious about the fact it does look like I have a magnet in there, I do. I have a magnet in there. I put one inside my brains. I embedded them secondary afterwards, and I really didn't need it, which is why I'm not including it in the instructions, because it was kind of a waste of magnets. So even though there was one that you could see there, don't necessarily worry about that. Just skip that step. So we've got our brains that came off with the aluminum foil, and then you can kind of play with putting them on. It's very snug, so you have to kind of work on it, and especially the first time or two, it's very, very snug. And so it might take a tweezers and a little bit of caution to get that to go on. Once you have your skull top piece sculpted, you can take the aluminum foil out, put it back on, and then take some more of your gray acrylic and add a few details that will create a continuation from the piece that's on the nail permanently to the piece that can come off. Mainly, I'm just going to be adding that little ledge right kind of around the temples of the skull, carrying that down and around the brow bone. That little line makes such a big difference in making this look more cohesive and solid than if it was just those pieces separate and there's no continuation at all on them. When you're sculpting that little edge there, make sure that you do not accidentally get any acrylic underneath that top skull part so that it attaches down permanently. After you have that done, I'm going to take some diluted black acrylic paint and I'm going to be just adding some more shading, more detail all around my skull. So when I'm using black acrylic paint versus black acrylic, when I say diluted, my favorite way to dilute my black acrylic paint is if I have a bottle that's always diluted and I just pour some water right into the bottle and I shake it up and I leave it that way. It is not very diluted, it's just mildly so that it's a little thinner, can create thinner lines easier on nails when you want really tiny stuff, little tiny details. But then if I need something more diluted than that, like in the case of adding the shading on the skull and I want to be more of a black wash, then I will take and I will dip my brush into the black paint, just the very edges of the bristles, and then dip it into my paint water, and then I will either go directly to the nail depending on how much paint I'm using, how big the brush is, or if I know that I need a little less product on my brush, I will use my thumb and I will mix it on my thumb. Acrylic paint is non-toxic, so you don't have to be worried about it, getting into your bloodstream or any of that. It's unlike gel paint where you do not want it to touch your skin. Acrylic paint is okay in that respect. Not that you necessarily want to paint your whole body with it, but a little bit on my thumb has never really given me cause for concern. This is where I use my tweezers to remove that top skull portion. It did not just want to slide off like pieces usually do. So then we're going to take and we're going to detail all the skull, or not the skull, the brain portion that's underneath the skull. Take some either black or burgundy or a darker color acrylic paint than what you used to use the acrylic. And then I'm going to take some bright white paint and I'm going to add lots of little highlights on top of each of those little brain segments to make them look wet. Those bright white highlights make it look juicy, and that's how we want our brains to look over here, is just juicy, juicy brains. Apply some gel sealer over the background, some 3D glaze over the brains, again, make them look kind of wet. Matte top coat over the skull, both the part that's completely attached to the nail and then the piece that can come off. And then it's all done. Make sure that all of those pieces dry completely, whether it's in a lamp or air dry in the case of the matte top coat and the 3D glaze, because you don't want them to accidentally stick together once you start playing with it and taking the skull apart and putting it back together. And that's it. That's the end of this one. If you are a Halloween fan like I am, definitely keep checking back throughout the month. I have so many amazing tutorials planned for October, and I will see you next time. Bye!